Well, ladies and gentlemen, in this video, I am going to be discussing the future of the legendary Lambeau Field. Certainly an NFL cathedral, possibly at this point the only NFL cathedral, right up there with Wrigley Field and Fenway Park. Those are MLB stadiums, though, and when it comes to Lambeau Field, originally breaking ground in 1956, opening a year later, it has seen several major renovations. I'm going to talk about those, and then I am going to talk about its future. How long does Lambeau Field really have? Could it be timeless? Could it possibly last for another 30 or 40 years? Will they get a renovation? Will they try and put an overhang? This is a stadium that I am 100% sure they will never try and put a roof on. And this is also a stadium I'm like 99% sure within the next 40 or 50 years this will be their stadium. I just cannot see. It's like Fenway Park, it's like Wrigley Field. They're just going to keep renovating it and renovating it and renovating it, and they have dumped big money into this stadium. It's very similar to like Madison Square Garden getting $1 billion renovation or Wrigley Field getting stuff done to it. These older stadiums, they will dump a lot of money into them. So you might say, well, it's really old, but with the renovations, they really modernized them. And Lambeau Field has really had two huge renovations. The first one spanning from 2001 to 2003, the cost was around $300 million, which was a huge deal when you think about inflation and a stadium renovation, probably adjusted for inflation. You're talking about $600-700 million for this renovation where they modernized the exterior. They added on a whole nother building, the atrium right next to that's connected to the Lambeau Field. And also they upgraded some of the premium seating, although they kept the seating bowl the exact same and many of the bleachers are the exact same. Also added in some suites and closed up the stadium fully. That was the first main renovation happening from 2001 to 2003. They did also renovate the atrium in 2013. It was around $150 million. And around that same time, Lambeau Field probably went through the biggest change it's had in terms of a different looking stadium. They added the extra seating section above the lower bowl behind the one end zone, which added about 7,500 more seats. And also there's some club sections up there as well. I think that looks really good. Obviously, Lambeau Field is always sold out. There's a really long waiting list. So adding those seats was a big deal. And it also doesn't take away from the identity of the stadium. It still is. You can tell it's an older stadium, even with that renovation. It's not like some futuristic, crazy, sweet level stuff. It's just a normal thing where they added some seats, and I think it looks good. Now, as for the stadium, they also have renovated the exterior, the atrium added onto the side. And when it comes to the future of Lambeau Field, the number one question, would they ever consider adding a roof? You know, there was a funny April Fool's joke. It was like last year where AI created a new Packers stadium and someone said that the Packers were getting a new stadium. Obviously, it is completely false. But when it comes to something like this, I really have to speak in the same way that I would talk about Fenway or Dodger Stadium or Wrigley Field. There's really no timeline I can put on it. Obviously, there's going to need to be more renovations at a certain point, but they did just dump almost like $400-500 million into it. Within the past 2 decades, adjusted for inflation, they've probably put well over $1 billion into this stadium within the past 2 decades. So the upkeep to the stadium has been impressive, just like Fenway Park, just like Wrigley Field, both of those stadiums recently getting renovations. So with this stadium, the idea of them possibly adding some type of overhang, some type of roof, obviously that's never going to happen. It is iconic, the frozen tundra. Normally you get at least one game, sometimes 2 games a year, where it almost just looks like frozen snow onto the field and the ground is really hard because in Green Bay it's like sometimes it gets to -5, -10 with the wind chill, sometimes even worse than that, especially if they make the playoffs and host a home game. And that is almost like a tradition. It's cool to see. They also do have really good weather in September and October for football. Once you get into November, it gets colder, but still September and October in Green Bay at Lambeau, September's pretty hot. Although Green Bay is very north, but you get into October, it's great weather, 50 degrees, 40 degrees, and what have you. and I would say for the future of the stadium, they will probably renovate it again. Although I will say the upkeep, the exterior, the bricking, it looks amazing. And the only thing I think you could argue is possibly changing the seating. Instead of all the bleachers, they would just change it all out to normal seats. I think that's probably the next big thing, not only with Lambeau, but with a lot of these college stadiums. Because we're seeing more and more of the colleges change some of the seating, put in bars, put in standing room areas. I believe that a lot of these massive lower bowls, and Lambeau's one of them, that have just rows and rows of bleachers, will all be changed out at some point. It would be interesting to see Lambeau with actual seats in the lower bowl. I think it looked pretty cool, honestly. I mean, it kind of looked like the LA Coliseum, if you're wondering, but the LA Coliseum has a massive lower bowl. It's a little bit different than Lambeau. Lambeau's is smaller, and then they expanded the capacity. When it comes to Lambeau possibly hosting a major event, it's just not going to happen. It would have been awesome if they actually tried to have a Super Bowl at Lambeau. It's just a crazy, crazy... You're almost flirting with death with something like that. Like, imagine there's a snowstorm. You wouldn't want the Super Bowl to be decided like that. They were kind of flirting with death when they went to MetLife, but that was a weird Super Bowl. It was like 50 degrees and rainy, but it would be awesome if they did put a Super Bowl in Lambeau and it was a nice cold weather, maybe some flurries. That would be totally different than what we're used to, but of course that's never going to happen. They will go to only domes or only warm weather climates from here on out. I know they went to MetLife. That was a one-off thing. It's very unlikely it's not going to happen. If they do go to a cold weather city, it's going to be a city with a dome like Minneapolis, like Detroit, something like that, and possibly also Chicago when they get their dome. So I don't see Lambeau hosting any crazy Super Bowl when it comes to the draft. I believe Lambeau already did host the draft, and maybe it'll get it again in the future, but obviously the NFL really doesn't have like an all-star game to host where it goes to different stadiums every year. I believe that's kind of been replaced or at least supplemented with the draft. Now, the draft technically is not at the stadium, but it's like outside of the team's stadiums, and now the draft is going to all different stadiums every year. I guess they call it different cities. It's the same thing because normally where they set up the draft is like right next to the stadium or at least near it. So in terms of like, do I think they could potentially add some type of overhang to it? I mean, they could, to where the field would still be open. Like, you look at the Buffalo Bills and what they're doing with their new stadium. They've got an overhang that protects some of the fans from the elements. You could do that around part of it. I think it would look really bad. It just doesn't fit Lambeau. And a lower bowl being covered by like an overhang that protects some of the fans from the elements. The other good thing about an overhang, especially with something like Lambeau, you're going to be able to trap the heat when it goes up, which will theoretically warm the lower bowl. But again, I wouldn't do that, honestly. And obviously, Lambeau's never going to be getting a roof or anything crazy like that. Although it would be crazy if they somehow got something like that. It is not going to happen. It just doesn't make sense. It's like the one cathedral in the NFL. So I would say you could be looking at the next big renovation as changing out all of the bleachers for normal seats. Other than that, it's really hard to predict anything crazy big happening to Lambeau Field, considering they just renovated the exterior of the stadium. It looks beautiful. Also, they added all the seats. You could argue, well, would they add more seats to the other end zone and possibly raise the seating even higher because of the demand? I highly doubt it. I don't think they're going to raise the capacity even more. I think they're going to leave it just as is. But hypothetically, you could say they could do the exact same thing to the other end zone that they did to the one end zone, adding all the seats. But either way, guys, that will do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.